Well, welcome to Science on Tap, September edition. This event is brought to you by the Trinity River Restoration Program and the Trinity County RCD. We're really excited to welcome Nate Libal, wolf specialist for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Oh, clapping.
Tepid applause, that's good, yeah.
Nate came all the way from, where were you?
I was over in Lassen County earlier today,
Lassen County. Long drive, lots of construction.
Yeah.
Prior to joining CDFW in 2024, Nate spent 10 years working in wolf management programs in Oregon and Wisconsin, one of my favorite states. If anyone didn't know that. Nate holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Natural Resource Conservation from the University of British Columbia and a Master of Science in Wildlife Science from Mississippi State University. He's been all over. His presentation tonight, Gray Wolves, Ecology and Management in California, will explore the recent history of wolf populations in California, including current pack numbers, distribution, as well as ongoing research. So please help me give Nate a really warm welcome.
So yeah, thanks for having me. It's really good to be here. This is only the second time I've been through Weaverville, and it seems like a super cool place. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. She kind of already presented, what I'm hoping to go over today. And I did just want to say that I'm okay with us deviating a little bit from the plan. I know we're only supposed to have about 45 minutes, and with wolves, you can definitely go a lot longer than 45 minutes. I'm expecting there to be a lot of comments and questions, and that's fine. So really, my main goal is just that I hope everyone can be respectful and have a productive conversation. I know this is like a hot button topic for a lot of people. People get really worked up about this, and there's reasons for that. Obviously, wolves are complicated, and that's okay. We can disagree on this and still have a civil conversation. But yeah, I just want to be able to talk to you today about how did we get here, and where are we going in the future. And one of the big things I do want to cover, and so it's kind of the second half of my presentation, is about conflict. And so specifically, what kind of conflict do we see, both in California and across the West, and what is the department doing to try to mitigate that conflict, and what are we hoping to do in the future? I hope it won't be so much a lecture as kind of an open forum, as I said. So please raise your hand, at any time if you have questions. I don't know that we can get to all of them right in the middle, but I'll try. I mean, if there are things that you want me to talk about, let's talk about them. And if I don't get everything I had planned, that's fine. No hands yet? That's good. Okay, just a little bit of history to start with. I think most folks are probably aware, but like all lower 48 states besides northern Minnesota, gray wolves were extirpated. And for California, that was in the early 1900s. And this historic abundance and distribution of wolves in California really is kind of the first point of controversy to discuss. And that's because a lot of folks think that we do not have the same wolves here today that we had before. And in some ways that's true because they were extirpated, so those wolves were gone. But that's no different than a lot of other wildlife species around North America. A lot of places that have elk now, those aren't the same elk that were there. We had to reintroduce them. Same with bison, same with a lot of species. And one of the reasons that it's hard to really know for sure, where were wolves and how many were out there is because there wasn't really good record keeping during the time that the wolves were extirpated. For some states, there are fairly good records on bounties. But California doesn't really have really great records. One thing that you find is that coyotes and wolves were lumped together as a prairie wolf or some other name, and so it's hard to separate them. But another reason for that is actually a lot of the removals probably occurred while there was still Spanish rule here, and so we don't have the records that would have been here at that time. We only have a couple of wolf specimens from this period in museums. But based on information on what we know from other states and habitat, it's generally believed that wolves were historically pretty widely distributed, but at fairly low densities throughout the state. Wolves and other predators were mainly removed for economic reasons. Predators do sometimes kill livestock. We'll talk a bunch about that today. So as ranching operations moved west, ranchers had a very real incentive to kill predators off. There also were bounties that kind of fueled this, so there's an additional economic reason for folks to go out there and remove them. And European expansion across North America led to an increasingly populated and developed landscape with declines in many species, not only predators, but a lot of other species that I mentioned, deer, elk, bison. And with these changes, though, folks started to get concerned at what was happening, and sentiments really started to change during the early and mid-1900s, where we started to shift from an overall kind of viewpoint from the public of human dominion over the natural world towards more of a wildlife conservation ethic, which we mostly have today. A big part of the wolf story is the 1973 Endangered Species Act. So those protections went in across the country, outside of Alaska, and those protections allowed expansion in two ways. One was there was an intact wolf population that I mentioned already in northern Minnesota that was never extirpated, and from Canada. So we started to see populations expand from Minnesota into Michigan and Wisconsin, and we saw animals moving from Canada to northern Montana. And at the same time, I'm sure folks have all heard about the reintroduction of wolves from Alberta into Yellowstone National Park in northern Idaho, which occurred in 1995 and 1996. And that is the second point of controversy to talk about is, again, well, actually, this is still kind of the first. And so are these the same wolves? And so, I hear a lot of people talk about the non-native Canadian timber wolf that we have here. And all I can say is, as a scientist, the way I look at it is a gray wolf is basically a gray wolf. They're the same species. And because the population historically was so good at occupying habitat, they basically occupied almost all of North America. There was gene flow between all these little populations all the time. So wolves were very closely related across their range. So, I can't say 100% that the genes are exactly the same now, but it's the same species. And really what I say to folks too is that I don't know that there really is much of a difference. If you go north in their range, there is a slight difference on average in size, with wolves getting slightly larger as you go up in latitude, slightly smaller as you go, south in latitude. But, Canadians are still there. They're not all getting killed by wolves. They're not more dangerous up there. Wolves that are very small, the Mexican gray wolf, are killing livestock, same as wolves from Canada. So a wolf's a wolf in my view. And I think really the argument more comes down to, do we actually want wolves here at all, rather than, which wolves are here? And that's a fair argument to have. So those source populations from both the natural recolonization that was happening from Canada to northern Montana and the releases into Yellowstone and northern Idaho quickly expanded, first into Washington and Oregon. And it became clear that wolves were likely to make it on their own to California. So in 2011, OR7, very famous, was a male wolf from northeastern Oregon that came into California, and that was the first confirmed wolf in the state since 1920s. And folks knew now it's real, they're coming. So what happened was a wolf stakeholder working group was formed in 2013, and that group met for several years to help develop the conservation plan for gray wolves in California, which was adopted in 2016. And the plan does kind of represent another point of controversy in a couple of ways. And one of the main ways is that the stakeholder groups involved with the development of that plan, they did include a pretty wide swath of interests. There were county agricultural commissions. There were groups like the California Deer Association, Farm Bureau, Houndsmen for Conservation, the Wolf Center, Wool Growers Association, Center for Biological Diversity, Defenders of Wildlife. It goes on and on. So there was an attempt made to get a lot of different folks with different viewpoints at the table, but it just is a fact of life that you can't get everyone at the table. So some folks might feel like their interests weren't fully represented in that process. But this was the best the state felt like they could do at the time. And so within the sideboards that are set by both federal and state law, and it's important to note that wolves are currently both listed as a state endangered species and a federal endangered species, the management plan basically spells out what the goals are for the department and how we're going to meet those goals. And really it dictates what I do day to day in my job. So a couple of interesting and important things to know from the plan. There's a couple of definitions that are important. So in the plan, a pack and a breeding pair are used throughout the document. And they're used by CDFW to share information to the public about the wolf population and evaluate what phase of recovery we're currently at. So the metrics, the pack, it's in California, it's considered 2 or more wolves traveling together and using a definable area. And a breeding pair is a mated male and female pair, which have produced pups, and at least 2 of those pups survive to the end of a calendar year. And that's when we do our important count, our end of year count is at the end of the year. The other thing that's in the plan, which makes this all very difficult, is that there are 5 overarching goals that are identified, and those are conserve biologically sustainable populations of wolves in the state, manage the distribution of wolves where there is adequate habitat, manage native ungulates to provide abundant prey for predators, intrinsic value or intrinsic enjoyment for the public and hunting opportunities, manage wolf livestock conflicts to minimize losses, and to communicate conservation management needs for wolves as well as the effects they're having in California. So as you can imagine, that's challenging for a few reasons. And one is, how do we weight these? So for instance, the easiest way to minimize livestock losses would be to have the fewest number of wolves possible. However, if we had the fewest number of wolves possible, would that mean not conserving a biologically sustainable population? A biologically sustainable population is dependent on a lot of factors that include the ability of wolves in neighboring states to immigrate into California, a healthy food base and habitat, disease issues, genetic diversity, and level of mortality. All of these can change over time. They're not static. And another thing that I kind of think about when I'm driving around is, what is adequate habitat? Wolves are highly adaptable and capable of living in most areas of California if there's food there and we don't kill them. And that's just the reality. So what is adequate habitat to the public? Is it only areas where there are no livestock, only public lands? If that were the case, that would largely restrict wolves to wilderness areas, because most public lands outside of wilderness areas are also used by livestock. And wilderness areas are almost all high elevation areas that, at least in the winter, have little to no food for wolves, and they can't live there. As we manage ungulate populations, which of these benefits is most important? How do we continue to allow for all of these benefits, especially as we deal with things like large wildfires, CWD, and other diseases and other issues? It's a huge challenge, and we're not there yet. We're trying, but there's work to be done. So in the plan, there are 3 phases of wolf recovery identified, and it's based on the number of breeding pairs that I mentioned before. So that would be a male and female with 2 young that survived to the end of the calendar year. And so phase 1 is the initial recovery stage. That's less than 4 breeding pairs for 2 consecutive years. And under that, there's monitoring of the wolves, no opportunity for state delisting, and no injurious hazing, no take, and that would mean lethal take. We were in phase 1 from the time wolves moved into the state and we had a management plan until the end of 2024. As of 2025, we're in phase 2. So we've had at least 4 breeding pairs for 2 consecutive years. And what that means as far as changes is that now we can do a review of status, and so that would be a review of their state legal status as an endangered species. Injurious hazing and take may be allowed if legal, both in the state and federally. And then eventually, if we have more than 8 breeding pairs for 2 consecutive years, we'll move into phase 3. So that theoretically could happen as soon as the beginning of 2027. The only differences really there are that this potential to petition delisting, that would mean if we moved into phase 3 and the species were not yet delisted at the state level, there could be an active petition to say we need to do that. Nothing yet? So going from an endangered species to not an endangered species, yeah, which really affects our ability to have take or any injury to the animal.
And that is based on 4 breeding pairs across the entire state?
Across the whole state. This is statewide. There aren't any management zones identified currently in the management plan. Yep. All right. So now we're kind of just getting into what I do day to day. So the wolf monitoring. And this slide illustrates how CDFW goes about collecting information on the population in support of the plan. It starts by finding the wolves, which is a challenge, let me tell you, either through following up on public reports, other agency reports, or through our own monitoring efforts. And that happens in the form of cameras, track surveys, howl surveys, audio recorders, various other tools. Once wolves are located, we collect DNA, and that's usually in the form of scat, and attempt to get a collar in the group. And that radio collar is super important to us because it allows us to delineate an accurate territory. It tells us that the wolves we're counting here are not the same wolves we're seeing in other places. And it assists producers with identifying and mitigating conflict. It's a big part of our conflict mitigation. I should say too, I'm just gonna say it in this part too. So this public reporting thing, super important. If you go to our website, all you have to do is Google CDFW wolf. It'll pop up. There's a button right there to report your sightings. folks send those in all the time, and I know I get feedback sometimes that no one listens to these, no one cares. That's not true. They come to my email, I look at all of them. Now, of course, I'm pretty busy, so I've got to classify them. And I know folks don't like this sometimes, but there are times people are sure they've seen a wolf. They send me a picture, it's a dog or coyote. I know it 100%. And I try to be good about, showing folks why that is. That I don't want them to just think this is going into a black box and I'm ignoring what they're seeing. But I'll send them pictures of other wolf photos. They can see the differences in the future. But some of those are real. And really, that's where most of these wolves are found, because I'm one person out there. I cover basically everything north of Sacramento. I cannot find all the wolves out there on my own. The locals almost always know there are wolves there before I do, and that's not surprising. So I'm really counting on folks to share that information with me, especially in places like Trinity County where we don't have resident wolves identified yet. This is kind of just highlighting some of our operations over this last year. So in January of last year, we were able to get a helicopter to help with putting out radio collars. And that led to capturing 12 wolves in 3 different packs. What happens during those operations is that a helicopter crew, it's a trained crew that has done a lot of these animal capture operations. They use a dart gun to chemically immobilize the wolf in the air. Once the wolf is unconscious, the helicopter lands, picks up the wolf and transports it to a central processing site where me and other biologists are. We take samples, we place a radio collar, and we monitor the vitals. The wolves are then placed in crates, and once the immobilization drugs have worn off, they're released back into the territory near where they were first drugged. So that's the breakdown from this past year. There are 5 animals in the BAMSEO pack. That's over south in the Sierra Valley area. We'll talk about that more later. Harvey is northwest of Susanville, and the whaleback pack is up in Siskiyou County, east of Wairika. Yeah, sure.
From time of capture to release is how long?
Okay, the question was from time of capture to release is how long? And the answer is it varies quite a bit. So depending on how we capture the wolves, we actually use different types of drugs. And the type of drug we use for aerial operations is called telazol. And it's a drug that does not have a reversal. So what that means is some drugs, there's a separate drug that you can use to wake them back up again almost immediately. Telazol doesn't have one of those. So once you drug them, they are down until they process that drug. And it varies a lot by animal, and we see actually a lot of times age is a big part of it, that you get a younger animal, it burns through the drug faster. You get an older animal, the metabolism's not quite as good anymore, it takes longer. So the other part of that is that we need to use a fairly high dose to get them down quickly, because the whole helicopter operation, it's fairly dangerous for everybody involved. It can be dangerous for the wolf if they're running through scree slopes, heavy timber. It's really dangerous for the aerial crew too. So we want that wolf to go down fast. So it's a big dose. Luckily it's a safe drug, but they're getting dosed more than twice what we would normally give them if they were just on the ground in a trap or something. So yeah, they're oftentimes under a long time. It'll be anywhere from an hour. We had one animal that actually wasn't really waking up this past winter, and we kept it overnight in a crate and released it the following morning. So it took about 12 hours for that animal to fully come out of it. And we do really want to make sure that they are fully out of it so that they don't hurt themselves or run into any trouble. Okay, this chart is showing the annual wolf population growth from 2015 through the end of 2024. The main metric CDFW uses is an end-of-year count. I mentioned that before. That's consistent with how other Western states record their recolonizing wolf populations. It's a count of the minimum number of wolves present on December 31st, and is therefore an underestimate of the actual number of wolves. And that's, I guess, another point of controversy is a lot of folks will tell me all the time, we're getting our count totally wrong, we don't know what we're doing. There's a lot more wolves out there than we're saying. There's, I think, 2 reasons for that. I think one is just people don't always trust the government and CDFW, and that's fine. But I think a big part of it is not understanding the biology of wolves, and then kind of perceptions as far as, I could say there's 50 wolves in the state, I could say there's 500 wolves in the state. If you don't like wolves, you think there are too many wolves. So I think no matter what number I use, you're probably going to think there are more out there. But I think a big part of it is the biology. So this graph is a little bit confusing, but what it's trying to show you here is how that population changes throughout the course of a year. And so basically what you have is with wolves, they breed once a year. They breed in April, and so you have this birth pulse. And right after that birth pulse happens, the population's at its maximum for that year. And so that's the green bar here on the right of each one of these annual bar graphs here. That was the maximum number of wolves when you count all the pups. And the light blue is the number of pups that were produced in that birth pulse. By the end of the year, a lot of those pups die. You have individuals that have grown up, the yearlings and 2-year-olds. They want to leave and start their own pack, so they disperse. Some of those animals end up moving to Oregon. They go other places. And so your population is gradually going down until you hit December 31st, and really until you hit the following April when they breed again. So 2024, end of the year, there was a minimum, and we know there were more out there, but there was a minimum of 50 wolves in the state, and that included 72 pups that were born. So quite a few. And this is statewide. Where were those animals? So this is the end of year map of where they were. So almost all Northeast California. You've got the whaleback pack, which had a count of 8 up in Siskiyou County. Harvey, 8 there in Lassen. Bamseo, 5, another pretty big pack. Lassen pack, that's a famous one because it was the second pack in the state. It's currently the longest continuously active pack in the state with 4. And then if you go way down in Sequoia National Forest, we have a pack down there, the Alumni pack, had a count of 9. That pack is actually not doing very well now. There was mange that broke out in that pack, and quite a few of those animals have died this year. Some of the other things to note from this map, though, and these maps are also updated about every quarter on our website, so you can kind of see what's happening out there, is the yellow boundaries are established packs. So back to our definition, that's 2 or more wolves traveling together in a definable area, and it's usually for at least 6 months. And then we throw up one of these polygons. And the polygon's based on how much information we have and where those animals roam. At first, it just ends up being a circle because we don't know really anything other than a couple of detections. As we get collars out and get genetics, get cameras out, get more detections, then you get to start to get these better polygons that are based on actual location data and is more accurate. The hashed areas, so those are what we call areas of wolf activity. We've confirmed that wolves are in that area, but we haven't confirmed there's at least 2 of them for 6 months. And so they go up initially, and we wait and see if they'll persist. And they don't always persist. So that happens quite a bit. You might have a single wolf move into an area, it's waiting to find a mate, it never does, it moves on or dies. Sometimes you have 2 that show up in an area, and you think they're going to produce pups and make it, and for whatever reason they don't like each other, and they go their separate ways after a few months. So those are areas that we're keeping an eye on. I will say that this MODOK one has not been active in a while. That was created early part of the year due to some depredations that happened over there, so death of some livestock, and it created quite an uproar, I'll tell you, over there. And what we found out, though, was from genetics from those depredations it was 3 animals, 3 males, and all 3 of them came from the whaleback pack. And since those depredations happened, I think the last one was sometime in maybe late February, maybe early March, we've had no detections over there. So I'm not convinced at this time that there are still wolves in that area. But we are getting sightings in other areas. So we have detected at least 1 male kind of up west of Goose Lake through genetics. I recently picked up tracks of at least 2 animals down here in the southwest part of MODOK. And there are various other areas in here too that we're following up on reports. So the map's always changing. As far as collars in the state, we currently have 14 active radio collars around the state. 3 of those are in whaleback, 5 in the Harvey pack, 3 in Bamseo, 2 in the Alumni, and 1 in the Ice Cave pack, which was just put on a couple weeks ago. All right, move on to some basic stuff. And maybe I should have started with this, but what is a wolf? Let's talk about that a little bit. Some biology and ecology of wolves in our state. So wolves in California, they're either going to be black or gray in color. Both fade to an almost white with age oftentimes. And it's actually quite noticeable, I find, more on the black animals actually than the gray, that within a couple of years you get this much more silvery appearance on the face and the saddle. That animal is not very old. It's a couple of years old, and it's already faded quite a bit. Black is the genetically dominant color. They're sexually dimorphic, and what that means is that the males are on average a bit larger than the females. And at maturity here in the state, we see males are typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 95 to 100 pounds versus 80 to 85 pounds for a female. They're big. They're big bone structure. They're close to 30 inches tall at the shoulder. They've got amber or brown eyes that slant downwards in the middle towards the snout. The tails are typically held straight down or out, even while they're running. They've got proportionally smaller rounded ears, long blocky snout. And although they have that really thick bone structure, they're very narrow chested, and that's because wolves have to travel. They live on their feet. That's how they make their living. They typically travel somewhere in the neighborhood of about 14 miles a day on average, looking for food. And so they've got that narrow chest to make movement more efficient. Coats are mottled, so you don't really see distinct sections of one color or another like you do on a lot of dog breeds. And because they're so tall and have that big bone structure, folks tend to overestimate their size. I mentioned already the weights. Really, seeing a wolf much over like 110 pounds would be a really kind of surprising thing. And a lot of reports I get, people think they're 200 pounds or 180 pounds. And it's because they look so big. I mean, they're tall. 30 inches it's tall. And especially in the wintertime, they get this really thick coat on them. And it's deceiving. You get one up close, and they do look awfully big, but usually the weight's not quite as big as you might think. So they live in family groups of usually an unrelated breeding female and male, and their offspring for multiple years. I say usually because there are cases of inbreeding, but it's pretty rare in most natural systems. Wolves tend to not want to mate with animals that are related to them. So I've seen it a couple times now where we'll get like a sibling pair that set up shop somewhere, and they ultimately go their separate ways. They don't end up breeding. If there's no other options out there, I'm sure they will. It's happened some other places, but in general, it's pretty rare. They're what we call an obligate coursing predator. That means that they almost entirely subsist on meat, and they have to range far and wide to find their prey. So once prey is located, they typically chase that prey rather than attempt to ambush them. As far as sign, when you're out looking, I've got a picture of some wolf scat and some tracks there. They're highly territorial. Wolf packs use a consistent home range, which could be upwards of 500 square miles or so in California, and will actively defend that from other wolves and other canines, particularly around sensitive sites like dens and rendezvous sites, which I'll mention a little bit more later. And what a rendezvous site is it's basically a nursing area for the pups. So when they're born in a den. Eventually, when those pups are a little bit bigger and can start moving around, they'll move to these rendezvous sites, and there might be one rendezvous site, there could be 20 in the course of a year, but they're typically areas that the pups will stay during the day, and then the rest of the pack goes out and provisions them with food and comes back to it. Wolves are very defensive of those areas. Their territories are marked with urine and scat. At any given time, there may be dispersing wolves moving across the landscape looking for mates and empty habitat to start their own pack. They're very highly social. They use scent, howls, and body language to communicate with each other. And then just for some track and scat characteristics here, for the tracks, they're big. So we've got a front track here, the larger one. Front foot's bigger than the hind foot. And usually what you're looking at is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 inches in length. It's pretty big if you get out a ruler. They've got very robust pads. They're what we call an interdigital pad here. It has 2 lobes in the back, and it's kind of pointed in the front. There is a symmetrical track, so if you were to put a line down the middle, they're kind of mirror images of each other. The claws typically show. And one thing you can kind of look for too is movement patterns. So because they have to live on their feet, they don't want to waste energy. So a lot of times I'll be out there looking at tracks, and there are times when I can't tell from one track if it's a dog track or a wolf track. There are some livestock protection dogs that are out there that are pretty big, some other breeds that can be pretty big. And then I'm looking for form. So wolves trying to not eat up a lot of energy, they do 2 things. One is with that narrow chest is when they're walking, they direct register, which means their feet all fall in the same spot. So on dogs, that's rare. Normally their chest is a little bit wider, and so there's overlap or even separation between the tracks. On a wolf, they typically line up right on each other. And then you can kind of look at stride length too, which for a wolf is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of like 42 to 45 inches. But one of the common things they do is they move in this 2x2 trot, we call. And so what happens there is that the front foot ends up falling just slightly behind the hind foot, but there's 2 distinct tracks, then a separation, 2 distinct tracks, 2 distinct tracks in a straight line right down the road. Whereas dogs, I'm sure a lot of you who own dogs know the dog's just wandering this way, sniffing that. It knows it's got kibble at home. It's not worried about wasting energy. It's going all over the place. The one time where that can really throw you, though, is if people like to run their dogs on roads. So if they let the dog out and then just start driving, the dog will do the same thing, but it's running. It's running the whole time. So those are some of the things we look at. For scat, at least, it's a ropey appearance. So you get this kind of not very smooth, ropey appearance. A lot of times it's tapered on one end. usually an inch or more in diameter. And you can kind of learn a lot from the scats. So the way the wolves process a carcass normally is that, oh my God, I'm at 30 minutes already. I got to hurry up. We'll save that till after. If you have questions about scats, let's talk about that after. Seasonal movements. I mentioned the pups in the dens and the rendezvous sites. So during spring and summer, that's what happens, is that this is kind of showing you an annual home range for a pack and how they move throughout the year. So when they have to provision those pups at either the den or the rendezvous site, those adults are going out and they're coming back, out and coming back. We call it a wagon wheel. They're going back to that central site, and they're typically using a smaller section of their home range. During the winter, so once those pups get to about right now, actually, it's usually sometime in mid to late September, they're big enough that they can travel with the rest of the group. And so then they become nomadic. They're usually all together, and they travel the whole range of the territory looking for prey throughout the winter until you reach that next April and they give birth again. The dens are commonly dug out tunnels or hollowed out trees and logs. Pups are weaned at about 6 to 8 weeks. I got to get to the important stuff, so I'm going to keep going. We currently have a wolf project. It's with UC Berkeley, and they're doing some really important stuff for us. So some of the things they're trying to do for us is answer all these questions, which is going to be hard, but we need these answers. So we need more information on not just the home ranges of wolves, but what's the specific habitat use within those home ranges. Occupancy predictions, so that would be look at where the wolves are now. What do we think is going to happen in the next 10 years across a wider swath of California based on what we've seen so far. Depredation patterns, so when are wolves attacking livestock, when are they not? What are some of the other tools we can use? And that kind of also goes into the conflict reduction and compensation programs. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? How can we help ranchers out more? Diet analysis, so we do collect all the scats typically it's at the dens and the rendezvous, and then we process those for metabarcoding, which what that lets us do is ID the genetics of every prey species that's within that scat. Native ungulates and carnivore densities, so we've got a really large trail camera network, both within packs and outside of pack territories, to look at the distribution of different species within the territory and outside of it, presence, absence, and number of detections. One of the other important things that we're doing with the depredation work too is that we're trying to get out to kill sites as quickly as possible. So what we do is 2 times in the summer, and it's usually August, we'll jack up the locations on those collars so that they're every 30 minutes. And then in February, we'll do the same thing. We'll jack up the locations on the collars so that we identify clusters really quickly. And those clusters are likely either a bed site or somewhere where they're eating on something. And if we can get out there quickly enough, we can not only collect the scat to see what they were eating, but if there's still a decent carcass there, we can say, did they kill that animal or did they scavenge on it? And that's super important, I think, both for native ungulates and for cattle to be able to answer that question. Okay, switching gears and talking about conflict in my last 13 minutes or so. It's a huge deal. Let's talk about why wolves are so controversial and elicit such a strong emotional response from people. And I do want to kind of be fair to everybody. So I'm going to quickly cover some of both the positive and negative sentiments towards wolves that have been relayed to me by members of the public. But I do want to be clear that I'm not saying that every rancher or every animal advocate or any of you share any or all of these feelings, or that this is an exhaustive list. But this is a complicated issue, but each of these sentiments has been shared to me at some time. So on the positive side of things, folks will point to wolves being a charismatic species. And so there's a number of reasons for this, but wolves do elicit a bigger emotional response from most people than a lot of other species. There's a lot of people that came out to hear this tonight. If I was doing this on earthworms, I don't know that I would have gotten the crowd. And that's just the reality. I don't think earthworms are any worse than wolves, any better or worse, but it is just what it is. And I think a lot of it is that they're so similar to domestic dogs, they do elicit a big emotional response from people. They'd also feature quite prominently in a lot of the cultural histories of different people around North America. But there is a counterpoint to this, that should wolves get all the attention and resources they do when there are other more imperiled but lesser known species out there? Another point some people will bring up is that the ecological role of the kind of keystone predator has been restored. And so the point of that is that kind of by providing the necessary conditions for a sustainable population of an apex predator like wolves, you're also thereby ensuring the integrity of the entire food chain in that system. One of the counterpoints to that argument would be that humans can fill that role as an apex predator, and we basically were doing that from the time that a lot of these predators were extirpated till.
We suck as an apex predator. Okay, we have no discrimination. We take the prime from the herd, not the weak and the the ones that need to be culled. We do everything absolutely wrong. It's up to the wolves to keep the herd healthy.
Well, and here we're hearing another point to this. Yeah, I mean, that's one. And there's a kind of a point and counterpoint to that too that I'll touch on real quick, I guess, since he brought it up. That you hear both sides of that. That wolves target the weak, right? So they'll make the herd overall healthier because they're only killing the weak. That's not true. They do a lot of times. They're experts at identifying vulnerability. But vulnerability doesn't mean that you're just old and sick. In certain situations, vulnerability might just mean you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or there happens to be a deep section of snow that you can't run through fast enough. And so, I mean, I've seen wolves pull down trophy elk, and it's because the elk made a bad decision and went somewhere where it now is vulnerable. It certainly does a lot of times mean that there's some sort of weakness. You start looking at carcasses that wolves have taken down, and it is really interesting. If there's enough left to look at, a lot of times you will see arthritic sections to the bones. They might not have any teeth anymore. They're really young, or oftentimes very vulnerable. So it's just one of those things that vulnerability can mean different things in different situations. Recreational opportunities. So a point might be that because wolves are charismatic and many people are interested in them, having the species on the landscape provides a better recreational experience for those who want to go into California's outdoors. Some people are out there just because they see or hear wolves. I do run into folks like that sometimes. A counterpoint is that calculating these non-consumptive, at least economic benefits for wolves is difficult. There's no harvest season in California, so there isn't a clear quantifiable economic benefit to having them here. Fulfillment of legal responsibility. So the State and Federal Endangered Species Act says that we are going to support the recolonization of wolves here until they're no longer at risk of extirpation again. One counterpoint to that is that at least at the federal level, there's been this long ongoing argument over the interpretation of the Endangered Species Act. And so does it mean that a species needs to be recovered throughout its historic range, or simply that it's not risk at overall extinction anymore? And that's one of the big ones that we run into with wolves, because there's tens of thousands of wolves up in Alaska. They're not going to be, as long as there's that population in Alaska and across California, gray wolves in North America are not going to be fully extirpated and extinct. But they certainly do not fill the whole historic range that they used to. And then just intrinsic value. So I mean, that's just the point is that species that do not pose a significant risk to humans have a right to exist. The more species that are healthy, the more resilient life is on Earth. A counterpoint is that some folks do think that wolves pose a significant risk to humans and the economy. On the negative side, I'm going to touch on each of these real quick in order of kind of least concern from my point of view to biggest concern. And again, I'm not saying I'm right about any of this, but from going on about 12 years doing this is kind of what I see out there. And so really the main things I hear on the negative side are safety to people, the effects they're having on ungulate populations, and then conflict, and it's almost entirely livestock conflict. So real quick on the safety front, this is the best information I could pull together on documented wolf attacks in North America, and it's based on 2 studies that were done looking at data since 1969. And just a few things I want to point out here is that it has happened. One is that overall they found 61 well-documented cases of what they considered aggression on the part of wolves. Some of those were due to rabies. Some were considered self-defense because people were messing with the wolves and probably shouldn't have been. People with dogs are a big one. So if you do have a dog with you in the woods, the wolves are likely to be more aggressive because they see that dog as a competitor. But there are cases of, habituated would be if they're being fed or something like that. But then there are these cases of unprovoked. So you're just happen to be in the woods, you run into a wolf, it acts aggressively. And really where you get kind of concerned is if you look at these unhabituated, unprovoked attacks. So someone's just out there, that wolf, as far as we know, has not been being fed by people. People didn't do anything wrong. And in 11 cases, there was some sort of aggression shown by the wolves. And that led to 20 injuries to people and 2 deaths. So the risk isn't zero, but this was just kind of back of napkin work by me to kind of just put things in perspective though. Now granted, there are a ton more domestic dogs across North America than there are wolves, but annually if you look at Canada, the US, you're looking at 5.5 million bites, missing a 0 there. leading to almost 1 million people in medical care and 21 deaths. And the gray wolf is just kind of looking at the numbers that we currently have across all of North America. And if you look at the information that we have on those injuries and deaths, this is like a per year amount you would expect through that time period from 1969 till now. It's about every 3 years you could expect there to be a bite somewhere in North America, and 0.04 deaths to people. So I mean, the risk is really it's not zero, but it is quite low. As far as wolves and native prey, this is estimated elk populations, the best I could find on our data, at least through time. So elk in California are increasing in both number and range, but compared to some other western states, there's far fewer currently than other places. Look at deer, you can see that there's a negative trend starting. That is not great, but I will say that mule deer are declining across the West. It's a big concern for a lot of states, not just here. And it's both within and outside of wolf range. And so there's likely not a single reason for that. Ongoing studies, including some by us, are looking at habitat loss, predators, disease, and other possible agents. And really at the end of the day, the degree to which wolves will impact our ungulate numbers will depend on their ability to subsidize with alternate prey if ungulate numbers decline. And so that's density-dependent predation. The classic example people point to is if you've got a single predator, single prey system, like lynx and snowshoe hare. Snowshoe hare increase in abundance, there's a ton of food. The lynx respond by increasing in abundance. Eventually you reach a tipping point where there's not enough rabbits for the lynx. They start to starve and they go down. And that's typically what you would expect to happen. But if you get into a situation where, let's say for whatever reason, elk remain completely vulnerable to wolves even while deer are declining, wolves can still have a negative impact on those deer because they're subsidizing. Even though there's less deer out there, they can persist at the numbers they're at on the elk, and then they're still occasionally taking those deer and causing a negative decline. And so those are the kind of studies that they're super hard to do and tease out, but that's kind of what we're looking at to see what happens over time. Okay, conflict, and I've really not left nearly enough time for this, but wolf conflict in California, across the western US, it primarily involves livestock, and it's a major challenge and focus for CDFW. There are really strong opinions and consequences depending on where you live and your livelihood, and I believe it's the single biggest challenge to managing the wolf population here. A lot of positive views of wolves are by people whose only interaction with a wolf is going to be in their mind. They might never even see one out in the wild. And they're excited, though, to know that there's this wild aspect to the state that's back. But there's often negative views from the folks that live in those communities where wolves are showing up. Citizens who live in these rural communities, ranching is culturally and economically critical to them. And any losses to wolves could have serious consequences to individual producers. It's really important, I think, also to recognize that ranch lands are important to all Californians for many reasons beyond livestock production. Private ranch lands are very important wildlife habitat for many species, particularly at lower elevations where public lands are less prevalent. This is kind of the sequence of events if folks think they've lost an animal to wolves, is they will report it to the department. Either me or another trained investigator will go out and investigate that, which will lead to some kind of determination and eventually compensation if I can say that there's a good likelihood that wolves are involved. So these are the six possible determinations. So confirmed wolf, pretty self-explanatory. I know wolves did it. A probable wolf death means that there is very good likelihood in that the evidence on the carcass suggests the predator that killed the animal was a wolf, but perhaps so much of the carcass has been eaten that I can't say that with 100% certainty. And then you kind of go down the list of maybe there's not enough evidence. In the case of a non-wolf depredation, I can clearly see that another predator was responsible. A non-depredation would be something like pneumonia. I open it up, the lungs are all bloodshot, it's got infection, something I know. And then unfortunately, there are situations where I can't know based on the amount of the carcass or the scene that's left there. As far as investigations, you can see they're real high in 2025. So it's not a shock that you're going to see as there are more wolves out there, we're going to have more conflict. But this year has been a very, very bad year. And what most of that points to is the next slide here, is the Bayamseo pack over in Sierra Valley. So just a huge difference in the amount of depredation. And so there's kind of two things to look at here. One is that this is not uniform across our pack areas. There are some pack areas where we see very little conflict. there are some that we see a ton. And I don't think there's always one reason for that. But I will say, as far as Bay of Paseo is concerned, there's probably a number of things at play there. And Berkeley's trying to figure out some of that with their study. One is that their initial results suggest that the density of native prey in that area is the lowest amongst all of our pack areas that we're studying. And the cattle density is the highest. So you've got the least natural prey probably, and probably the most non-natural prey. There are other things at play there, I think, too. It's a large valley with a ton of different producers working there, really good folks. But they've never dealt with wolves before. And so this all kind of happened really quickly this year. And I'll touch on a couple of things in a few slides here, but I do think there are things that ranchers can do to mitigate some of the risk. But all of that it's asking a lot. It's asking a lot of somebody who never asked to have these animals here. It's going to have some sort of cost to them to do this. And so it's a hard conversation to have with folks. And I want to say, this is kind of a hard slide to look at, but it's the reality that beyond the dollars and cents of, that's not supposed to be there. It's covering up some of the gore for you. Maybe that's good. But beyond the dollars and cents of livestock depredation, I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's an emotional toll here that these losses have on producers, and the impact on the depredated livestock as well. I don't personally believe that wolves are maliciously killing animals. I believe that they're really exceptional, as I said before, at identifying vulnerability and then capitalizing on it. But wolves are built to kill a certain way, and the way that is for a large prey animal is to run them and bite them over and over again until trauma kills that animal. That's how they have to do it. So for a large animal like adult cattle, this often means that there are upwards of hundreds of bites while the animal is still alive. That can be kind of seen here. In this case, this animal is still alive. It's not going to survive most likely. Based on the trauma it has on its hindquarters. And this is a dead animal, but all those bites that caused that bruising, that happened while that animal was still alive, and that's why the bruising is there. So it's a hard thing for folks to see. There's a number of recommendations and equipment that CDFW offers to producers to help reduce conflict. Some of this is actual just tools on the ground that we can offer people. This is a picture of turboflagery, and basically all it is it's electrified polywire with flagging on it. And if wolves have not seen this before, it's actually surprisingly effective at keeping them out of pastures for a while. And that's the caveat. There's kind of two caveats to this and with most of these tools is that this is kind of space dependent. It's really time consuming to put this up and maintain it. So really if you're looking at like 100 acres or less, this is pretty effective for like 2 months. And so a lot of times we'll use these around like calving pastures or if they're getting ready to ship cattle out and they know they're going to have something at a specific site for a couple of weeks. But on open range or something, it's just not feasible to put this out over 5,000 to 6,000 acres. And all these tools are kind of that way, where the smaller area you're looking at, the easier it is to use. Fox lights, they're a light that kind of comes on at night randomly. You can place them on posts out in the field. Rag boxes, they actually are tied to the radio collars of the wolves themselves. They detect when the wolf comes in close, and then all these alarms and sirens go off, and it can alert the producer. Drones are being used more and more, especially by USDA Wildlife Services, to actually actively haze wolves out of cattle where there's a problem. Range riding, so that's a big one, but again, this speaks a little bit to what you're asking producers to do. So I don't mean that just you're cowboying out there doing what you normally would do. I mean, range riding to be effective, it has to be focused on the wolves. So you got to be out there when wolves are most likely going to be active and attacking cattle, which is early in the morning and late at night. And so if you're a person that's already working, all day long on a ranch, it's awfully hard for me to say, hey, why don't you just spend the night out there for the next 2 months, keeping wolves out of your cattle. It's hard. It's really hard. But I do think a big one is removing attractants. So carcasses and bone piles, trash dumps, anything else that might be on a home ranch. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with a bone pile. I think that's a very normal thing for ranchers to do, especially in the absence of wolves. And basically what I mean by that is that a ranch is going to have a certain amount of just natural loss. A lot of times it's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 2%. So let's say you've got 100 cows, you can expect 2 of those cows are going to die every year just because. And normally what ranchers do is they've got one dedicated place where they dump all the carcasses, or if they're processing animals, that's where they dump all the remaining parts. That's fine if you don't have wolves. Once you have wolves, the wolves will find that thing immediately. I've seen it over and over again from collar data. I know where bone piles are because that's the first place wolves go when they enter a new valley, a new ranch area. And at first, a lot of times ranchers aren't even that worried about it because they just say, well, I mean, they're being fed, they're fine. But sooner or later, they're going to learn. They're going to be watching the cattle around there. Calving's going to come. There's going to be vulnerability of live animals, and they'll make that switch. So I think anything people can do as far as like burying the carcasses, cleaning that up, just make your ranch a less desirable place to start with before wolves are ever there is kind of the big step. And I think for all these tools, definitely if you're interested, contact me. We can talk about it. It's a lot easier to develop a strategy for ranches beforehand than to be playing catch up once wolves have already started depredating someplace. It becomes much, much harder. Another thing we do is share information. So this is relatively new this year, is this tracker. And so this is available to everybody. If you go to our website, there's this location mapper which shows you, it has little hexagons that light up and is updated every couple hours. These are all the collared wolves around the state. It'll tell you where they most recently were. Now there is a buffer on that because we don't want people out there shooting the wolves or harassing them. So this is used to show you generally what the risk might be in your area. But what I also do is that I'm always monitoring every morning the exact locations of where those wolves are. And if I'm getting a cluster of locations that suggest to me that there could be a dead cow, I'm contacting that individual producer to let them know. Because I want to help them. I mean, I want everybody to get the money that they have coming to them for this and to figure out ideas to fix the problem. So that's a really important part of my job. As far as compensation goes, it's kind of still in a pilot stage. So several years ago, $3 million was allocated for compensation, and so that includes direct loss, which would be those investigations. One of us comes out and confirms you lost an animal, you get fair market value for that animal. A lot of it went to two other things. One is pay for presence, and so the idea behind that is that we're not going to find all the animals that are killed, so folks are going to lose some portion of their, potentially lose some portion of their animals that's not going to be compensated through direct loss. But for some ranches, especially ones that are dealing with wolves a lot, there's all these other costs involved. There's that range riding. There's potentially loss of weight on the animals because they're getting run a bunch. If your herd gets run through a fence, now you've got to fix the fence to get your cattle back. There's all these other things that could be happening. And so the idea behind pay for presence was that if we know there's a distinct wolf territory and you're running your cattle in there, you're going to get a certain percentage on every head of cow you have out there, regardless of whether they get depredated or not. And then the deterrent tools are just what they sound like. If you want to buy some fox lights or fladry, the state was assisting with paying for that. Now that $3 million was paid out to 109 grants by March of 2024, so it lasted about 2 years, and then it was gone. And then we got an additional $600,000 late in 2024, but because it was such a smaller amount of money, we were only using that for direct loss. So those other two prongs went away for a while. We did just get another $2 million, and I've been told that that's going to open up these other prongs again in some capacity. But I don't know what that exactly looks like yet. This is still a pilot program, and the state's still trying to evaluate like what went right, what went wrong with the first round, and try to tweak things a little bit. I definitely didn't share everything I hoped to, but for contacts around the state, this is where you can get a hold of me or other people. Region 1, I work in both Region 1 and Region 2. So if you live in any of those northern counties, you can call me anytime if you want to talk about stuff. I'm often in the field, and so I won't promise that I'll pick up immediately, but if you leave me a message, I will try to get back to you. Region 2 also has Libby Ehlers. If you're down in Yolumne country, in that isolated pack, Chris Tatar is your guy, and then Axel Honeycutt is the statewide wolf coordinator. He works out of Sacramento, but he assists kind of all around everywhere. One quick thing before we kind of hit other questions, and depending on time, I'm going to stick around for a while. So if anyone wants to have just a smaller dialogue, I'll stick around for at least half an hour. We can talk about things because I didn't do as good a job as I'd hoped to. I was definitely really rushed. No, it's okay. I appreciate it, but it could have been better. But I did want to leave on, this is a really complicated, emotional, difficult issue. And so I did want to end on a lighter note and just say that, despite the challenges, I find wolf management really interesting and rewarding in a lot of ways. And, if people weren't so passionate, it wouldn't be such a neat species to work on. So I've included just some photos from the last few months just to show some of my experiences out there, and I've been lucky to have them. There's a lot of hard days. People do give me a pretty hard time sometimes, and a lot of stress. But I really do think we can continue to work towards a world where we have healthy wildlife populations without compromising people's livelihoods, and I think that's the goal. I think the key will be to approach the conversations with compassion and understanding, and that's a big part of this. Is that I think at the end of the day, people are fairly simple. Like we all want to have, a stable career that we enjoy, feel like we're safe and healthy, our families are, and that's the starting point. Like everyone wants that. That unites all of us. And then if you can see other people, even if it's a rancher and you live in the city or vice versa, like they're not that much different than you. And if folks can see each other that way, it's a lot easier to have the conversations about the things we do disagree on. And wolves are a big one. But I really do think we can get there if we just realize that, the other side isn't necessarily the enemy on everything. So anyway, yeah, the photos here are just, this is a den site, so this is pretty typical, this hollowed out log. That's where the wolves are going to spend about their first 6 weeks or so until they're weaned. Bunch of photos from the capture operations this past winter. I believe these are both Harvey individuals. This is the breeding female from the whaleback pack up in Siskiyou County. Picture of Mount Shasta there while I was out hiking around getting a camera. Some morning fog. It was a really nice morning after I got out of my tent and just took a picture of that. And then I spend a lot of time tracking wolves, and that's actually probably my favorite part of the job. Is I love doing tracking. So I like it when there's snow on the ground. I can go out and see what animals are doing, maybe get a howler response at night, and that's the best part of the job for sure. So anyway, yeah, thank you very much, and I'm going to stick around. Oh, we got a question. I'm going to run out here because I'm not going to be able to hear you.